In this module, we'll turn our attention to his argument in support of that negative thesis. And in specific, we'll look at the different potential criteria that an internalist might appeal to in deciding whether or not a set of doxastic decision principles are in fact right or not. And we'll see that Alvin rejects all of them as either indefinite or unacceptable criterion. The first will be actual optimality. It actually optimizes the goal of cognition. The second will be a belief which is justified that the set optimizes the goal of cognition. The third will be a mere belief that it does. The fourth will be a mere belief, but that belief was caused by a reliable belief-forming process. The fifth will be that the doxastic decision principle set itself prescribes that it's right. And the sixth, the one that he finishes with, is this notion that the right set of doxastic decision principles are the ones that we would make from the internal standpoint. And we'll note he thinks that this is an unfulfillable criterion because we could not make those sorts of choices without appealing to justified beliefs, at least justified beliefs about what principle to use to choose amongst various criterion candidates. So let's begin by reminding ourselves of his negative thesis. There is no definite and acceptable set of conditions that articulate the vague idea of the internalist as given in our preliminaries from the last module. Or, although such a definite set of conditions can be specified, there is nothing, no set of doxastic decision principles or rule of justification that meets those conditions. Alvin adopts the following strategy for establishing his negative thesis. He's going to argue for A by looking through the plausible candidates for what would be a right DDP. Most of the candidates that he considers, at least 1 through 5, aren't going to satisfy the internalist constraints that he's articulated in the last module. When we find a candidate that might satisfy these constraints, candidate 6, he's going to argue that B, that candidate, won't pick out any DDPs or rule of justification since there isn't one that would satisfy this notion of rightness of DDP. So let's look at each of these criterion in turn. The first criterion he introduces is a DDP X is right if and only if X is actually optimal. And Alvin's response to this is, no, wrong. This violates the discovery certifiability constraints. So this isn't something that we could actually have access to, that we could certify from within the internalist perspective. It's an objective fact, and as a result, our internal perspective can't see whether or not our perceptions match reality. Second criterion, a DDP is right if and only if we are justified in believing that it is optimal. So we ratchet it back a bit. We don't say that it's actually optimal, that we can bridge that gap between the internal perspective and the objective world. Instead, we think we're justified in believing that. Unfortunately, this is circular. So this won't work either because we can't be justified in believing anything until we determine what the right set of DDP actually are. What about our third criterion? A set of DDP is right if and only if we believe that it's optimal. So we back off the justification part, and now we just say we believe that it's optimal. But this criterion, of course, is much too weak. Just believing that they're optimal, that doesn't really give any warrant to the fact that they're optimal. You can have false beliefs. You can be wrong about these things. And so this won't pick out what looks plausibly to be a right set of DDP that leads us to our goal of cognition. Number 4, a DDP X is right if and only if we believe that it's optimal, and this belief was caused by a reliable cognitive process. So he tries to see if we can get around the problem that mere belief doesn't seem to be enough, but we can't directly appeal to justification by introducing the notion of a reliable cognitive process. But again, this, he thinks, is going to violate that discovery certifiability condition, because a belief being generated by a reliable cognitive process would be a fact about that process and that belief, one which we don't actually have direct access to from the internalist perspective. And so as a result, we couldn't certify that condition for held and couldn't use it to select a set of DDP as the right set of DDP. It's at this point that Alvin stops considering new versions of the criterion and turns his attention to a problem that he says has been lurking in these criterion all along. Specifically, they're specifying what it would be for us to choose a DDP, but the internalist perspective is fundamentally solipsistic. That is, there is no real us. We only have our internal perspective from which we can mount our quest for the right DDP. And so in this way, none of the candidates so far really, in fact, reflects the true nature of the internalist's project. And so to avoid the problem that using we violates that discovery principle, and to avoid the possibility that there might be no consensus as to an optimal DDP, but more important, just to emphasize the fact that Descartes' meditations, it's no accident that Descartes is by himself thinking about these issues in isolation from anyone else, because that is the internalist perspective. In order to accommodate that, he introduces modified relativized versions of principles 3 and 4. A DDP is right for some subject at some time, if and only if that subject believes at that time that that set is optimal. And for a DDP is right for a subject at a time, if and only if A, that subject believes at that time that it's optimal, and this belief was in fact caused by a reliable cognitive process. Unfortunately, he says, most people probably won't believe that any DDP is optimal, and hence 3-star and 4-star won't pick out any DDP. We might try, he thinks, introducing a new version of a criterion. Number 5, a DDP X is right for S at T if and only if X is applied to S's relevant inputs at T, and X prescribes the belief in X is optimal. So the objection that he's giving to 3 and 4 here, at least at this point, seems to be simply that most people aren't going to be engaging in this. So from their own subjective perspective, they're not really reflecting on this internalist project, and hence they're not forming any beliefs about it at any particular time. And so he says maybe what we can do is not require that they actually make those decisions or choices. Instead, we wonder whether or not we can formulate what it is to be a right DDP just in terms of what would be prescribed by their own beliefs at the time. Unfortunately, this fails to meet the discoverability principle, because multiple conflicting DDPs could satisfy 5 at the same time, and specifically, nothing about self-prescription guarantees any epistemic worth. Lots of sets of DDPs could prescribe themselves. Conflicting inconsistent sets could prescribe themselves. And so just like in the case with coherence, when we're looking at the coherence theory of justification, self-prescription in and of itself doesn't guarantee epistemic worth. So he says, I wonder then, should the internalists take this epistemic relativist turn that I've introduced in 3 and 4? Well, they really don't have a choice. That's the intellectual framework from which these choices have to be made, given the internalist project. But he gives it one go at trying to get out of these difficulties. So he says one might argue from analogy with ethics that there's a distinct subjective and objective notion of rightness of an action. And that would mean that there are two ways of spelling out such a notion. Doxaxic subjective rightness, which yields, he thinks, 3 or 3-starred, and epistemic subjective rightness, which would yield some form of 2. And so we think, I tried appealing to this notion of this difference between subjective and objective notions of rightness from ethics, but that doesn't actually get me anywhere outside of the principles that I've already considered, and so it doesn't look like it's viable that I can step outside of this subjective framework. Now he thinks, let's give it one more shot. So suppose we offer the following argument for such a relativization. We can clearly see that people who are in distinctly different epistemic contexts, like scientists and pre-scientists, so people from, the period before the Common Era and people from the 20th century or the 21st century. He said, we can see that these people are going to be in quite different epistemic contexts. But he thinks we can have this intuition that they're still justified in their beliefs within their own respective contexts. But he says, and this maybe is just a betrayal of his own externalist inclinations, he would side with the objectivists here and say that the pre-scientific person is not blameworthy. They're not unjustified, but neither are they praiseworthy. They're not justified. So he wouldn't make these distinctions between being justified and unjustified in epistemic contexts that violate the sorts of restrictions that we think are necessary for justification.